The 613 Commandments. Original list by Rabbi Moses Ben Maimon. Read by Cifmore. Part 1 of 2. Commandments 1 to 307. Commandment 1. SPREADSHEET, Chapter 1, Verse 28. Have children with one's wife. Commandment 2. SPREADSHEET, Chapter 32, Verse 32. Do not eat the sinew of the thigh. Commandment 3. SPREADSHEET, Chapter 12, Verse 15. Destroy all leaven on the 14th day of Nisan. Commandment 4. SPREADSHEET, Chapter 12, Verse 20. Do not eat mixtures containing leaven all 7 days of Passover. Commandment 5. SPREADSHEET, Chapter 12, Verse 19. Do not find leaven in your domain 7 days during Passover. Commandment 6. SPREADSHEET, Chapter 12, Verse 18. Eat unleavened bread on the first night of Passover. Commandment 7. SPREADSHEET, Chapter 12, Verse 2. Courts must calculate to determine when a new month begins. Commandment 8. SPREADSHEET, Chapter 12, Verse 48. An uncircumcised priest must not eat food set aside for a priest. Commandment 9. SPREADSHEET, Chapter 12, Verse 6. Slaughter the paschal sacrifice at the specified time. Commandment 10. SPREADSHEET, Chapter 12, Verse 8. Eat the Passover lamb with unleavened bread and bitter herbs on the night of the 14th of Nisan. Commandment 11. SPREADSHEET, Chapter 12, Verse 9. Do not eat the meat of the Passover lamb, raw or boiled. Commandment 12. SPREADSHEET, Chapter 12, Verse 46. Do not take the meat of the Passover lamb from the confines of the group. Commandment 13. SPREADSHEET, Chapter 12, Verse 43. An apostate must not eat from the Passover lamb. Commandment 14. SPREADSHEET, Chapter 12, Verse 45. A permanent or temporarily hired worker must not eat from the Passover lamb. Commandment 15. SPREADSHEET, Chapter 12, Verse 48. An uncircumcised male must not eat from the Passover lamb. Commandment 16. SPREADSHEET, Chapter 12, Verse 46. Do not break any bones from the Passover lamb. Commandment 17. SPREADSHEET, Chapter 12, Verse 10. Do not leave any meat of the Passover lamb over until morning. Commandment 18. SPREADSHEET, Chapter 13, Verse 3. Do not eat leaven all 7 days of Passover. Commandment 19. SPREADSHEET, Chapter 13, Verse 7. Do not see leaven in your domain 7 days during Passover. Commandment 20. SPREADSHEET, Chapter 13, Verse 8. Relate the SPREADSHEET from Egypt on the first night of Passover. Commandment 21. SPREADSHEET, Chapter 13, Verse 13. Redeem the firstborn donkey by giving a lamb to the priest. Commandment 22. SPREADSHEET, Chapter 13, Verse 13. Break the neck of the donkey if the owner does not intend to redeem it. Commandment 23. SPREADSHEET, Chapter 13, Verse 12. Set aside the firstborn animals. Commandment 24. SPREADSHEET, Chapter 16, Verse 29. Do not walk outside the city boundary on the Sabbath. Commandment 25. SPREADSHEET, Chapter 20, Verse 2. Know there is Adonai. Commandment 26. SPREADSHEET, Chapter 20, Verse 3. Do not entertain thoughts of other gods besides Adonai. Commandment 27. SPREADSHEET, Chapter 20, Verse 5. Do not worship idols in the manner they are worshipped. Commandment 28. SPREADSHEET, Chapter 20, Verse 5. Do not worship idols in the 4 ways we worship Adonai. Commandment 29. SPREADSHEET, Chapter 20, Verse 4. Do not make an idol for yourself. Commandment 30. SPREADSHEET, Chapter 20, Verse 23. Do not make human forms even for decorative purposes. Commandment 31. SPREADSHEET, Chapter 20, Verse 10. Do not do prohibited labor on the 7th-day Sabbath. Commandment 32. SPREADSHEET, Chapter 20, Verse 8. Sanctify the Sabbath from beginning to end. Commandment 33, Shemot, chapter 20, verse 7. Do not take Adonai's name in vain. Commandment 34, Shemot, chapter 20, verse 25. Do not build an altar with stones hewn by metal. Commandment 35, Shemot, chapter 20, verse 26. Do not climb steps to the altar. Commandment 36, Shemot, chapter 20, verse 15. Do not kidnap. Commandment 37, Shemot, chapter 20, verse 17. Do not covet and scheme to acquire another's possessions. Commandment 38, Shemot, chapter 20, verse 13. Do not murder. Commandment 39, Shemot, chapter 20, verse 16. Do not testify falsely. Commandment 40, Shemot, chapter 20, verse 12. Respect your father and mother. Commandment 41, Shemot, chapter 20, verse 10. Do not withhold clothing, food, or sexual relations from your wife or husband. Commandment 42, Shemot, chapter 21, verse 28. Do not benefit from an ox condemned to be stoned. Commandment 43, Shemot, chapter 21, verse 28. The court must judge the damages incurred by a goring ox. Commandment 44, Shemot, chapter 21, verse 33. The court must judge the damages occurred by a pit. Commandment 45, Shemot, chapter 21, verse 18. The court must implement laws against the one who assaults another or damages another's property. Commandment 46, Shemot, chapter 21, verse 2. Purchase a Hebrew slave in accordance with the prescribed laws. Commandment 47, Shemot, chapter 21, verse 8. Redeem Jewish maidservants. Commandment 48, Shemot, chapter 21, verse 8. Betroth the Jewish maidservant. Commandment 49, Shemot, chapter 21, verse 8. The master must not sell his maidservant. Commandment 50, Shemot, chapter 21, verse 20. The court must carry out death penalty of the sword. Commandment 51, Shemot, chapter 21, verse 17. Do not curse your father or mother. Commandment 52, Shemot, chapter 21, verse 15. Do not strike your father or mother. Commandment 53, Shemot, chapter 22, verse 21. Do not oppress the weak. Commandment 54, Shemot, chapter 22, verse 28. Do not curse Adonai. Commandment 55, Shemot, chapter 22, verse 16 to 17. The court must find one who sexually seduces a maiden. Commandment 56, Shemot, chapter 22, verse 31. Do not eat meat of an animal that was mortally wounded. Commandment 57, Shemot, chapter 22, verse 29. Do not preface one tithe to the next, but separate them in their proper order. Commandment 58, Shemot, chapter 22, verse 5. The court must judge the damages occurred by an animal eating. Commandment 59, Shemot, chapter 22, verse 6. The court must judge the damages occurred by fire. Commandment 60, Shemot, chapter 22, verse 1. The court must implement punitive damages against a thief. Commandment 61, Shemot, chapter 22, verse 21. Do not cheat a sincere convert monetarily. Commandment 62, Shemot, chapter 22, verse 21. Do not insult or harm a sincere convert with words. Commandment 63, Shemot, chapter 22, verse 10. The courts must carry out the laws of a hired worker and a hired guard. Commandment 64, Shemot, chapter 22, verse 14. The courts must carry out the laws of a borrower. Commandment 65, Shemot, chapter 22, verse 7. The courts must carry out the laws of an unpaid guard. Commandment 66, Shemot, chapter 22, verse 25. Lend to the poor and the destitute. Commandment 67, Shemot, chapter 22, verse 25. Do not press the poor and the destitute for payment if you know they don't have it. Commandment 68, Shemot, chapter 22, verse 25. Do not intermediate in an interest loan, guarantee, witness, or write the promissory note. Commandment 69, Shemot, chapter 22, verse 9 to 12. The courts must carry out the laws of the plaintiff, admitter, or denier. Commandment 70, Shemot, chapter 22, verse 18. The courts must not let a sorcerer live. Commandment 71, Shemot, chapter 22, verse 28. Do not curse judges. Commandment 72, Shemot, chapter 22, verse 28. Do not curse the head of the state or leader of the Saharin. Commandment 73, Shemot, chapter 23, verse 13. Do not swear in the name of an idol. Commandment 74, Shemot, chapter 23, verse 33. Do not let idolaters dwell in the land of Israel. Commandment 75, Shemot, chapter 23, verse 25. Serve the Almighty with prayer daily. Commandment 76, Shemot, chapter 23, verse 12. Rest on the seventh day Sabbath. Commandment 77, Shemot, chapter 23, verse 19. Do not eat meat and milk cooked together. Commandment 78, Shemot, chapter 23, verse 19. Set aside the first fruits and bring them to the temple. Commandment 79, Shemot, chapter 23, verse 11. Leave free all produce which grew in the seventh year. Commandment 80, Shemot, chapter 23, verse 18. Do not slaughter the paschal sacrifice while in possession of leaven. Commandment 81, Shemot, chapter 23, verse 18. Do not leave the fat of the paschal sacrifice overnight. Commandment 82, Shemot, chapter 23, verse 14. Celebrate on Passover, the Feast of Weeks, and the Feast of Tabernacles, and bring a peace offering. Commandment 83, Shemot, chapter 23, verse 5. Help another remove the load from a beast which can no longer carry it. Commandment 84, Shemot, chapter 23, verse 2. Decide by majority in case of disagreement. Commandment 85, Shemot, chapter 23, verse 2. The court must not execute through a majority of one. At least a majority of two is required. Commandment 86, Shemot, chapter 23, verse 2. A judge who presented an acquittal plea must not present an argument for conviction in capital cases. Commandment 87, Shemot, chapter 23, verse 7. The court must not kill anybody on circumstantial evidence. Commandment 88, Shemot, chapter 23, verse 6. A judge must not decide unjustly the case of the habitual transgressor. Commandment 89, Shemot, chapter 23, verse 8. Judges must not accept bribes. Commandment 90, Shemot, chapter 23, verse 1. Judges must not accept testimony unless both parties are present. Commandment 91, Shemot, chapter 23, verse 1. Transgressors must not testify. Commandment 92, Shemot, chapter 25, verse 8. Build a temple. Commandment 93, Shemot, chapter 25, verse 15. Do not remove the staves from the ark. Commandment 94, Shemot, chapter 25, verse 30. Make the showbread and place it before Adonai. Commandment 95, Shemot, chapter 27, verse 21. Light the menorah every day. Commandment 96, Shemot, chapter 28, verse 2. The priests must wear their priestly garments during service. Commandment 97, Shemot, chapter 28, verse 32. Do not tear the priestly garments. Commandment 98, Shemot, chapter 28, verse 28. Do not loosen the breastplate from the ephod. Commandment 99, Shemot, chapter 29, verse 33. The priests must eat the sacrificial meat in the temple. Commandment 100, Shemot, chapter 29, verse 33. A non-priest must not eat sacrificial meat. Commandment 101, Shemot, chapter 30, verse 13. Each man must give half a shekel annually. Commandment 102, Shemot, chapter 30, verse 31. Prepare the anointing oil. Commandment 103, Shemot, chapter 30, verse 32 to 33. Do not reproduce the anointing oil. Commandment 104, Shemot, chapter 30, verse 33. Do not anoint a foreigner with anointing oil. Commandment 105, Shemot, chapter 30, verse 37. Do not reproduce the incense formula. Commandment 106, Shemot, chapter 30, verse 9. Do not burn anything on the golden altar besides incense. Commandment 107, Shemot, chapter 30, verse 19. A priest must wash his hands and feet before service. Commandment 108, Shemot, chapter 30, verse 7. Burn incense every day. Commandment 109, Shemot, chapter 34, verse 26. Do not cook meat and milk together. Commandment 110, Shemot, chapter 34, verse 21. Rest the land during the 7th year by not doing any work which enhances growth. Commandment 111, Shemot, chapter 35, verse 2. The court must not inflict punishment on the Sabbath. Commandment 112, Vayikra, chapter 1, verse 3. Carry out the procedure of the burnt offering as prescribed in the law. Commandment 113, Vayikra, chapter 2, verse 1. Bring meal offerings as prescribed in the law. Commandment 114, Vayikra, chapter 2, verse 11. Do not burn honey or yeast on the altar. Commandment 115, Vayikra, chapter 2, verse 13. Salt all sacrifices. Commandment 116, Vayikra, chapter 2, verse 13. Do not omit the salt from sacrifices. Commandment 117, Vayikra, chapter 3, verse 17. Do not eat blood. Commandment 118, Vayikra, chapter 3, verse 17. Do not eat certain fats of clean animals. Commandment 119, Vayikra, chapter 4, verse 13. The high court must bring an offering when it rules in error. Commandment 120, Vayikra, chapter 4, verse 27. Every person must bring a sin offering for his or her transgression. Commandment 121, Vayikra, chapter 5, verse 1. Anyone who knows evidence must testify in court. Commandment 122, Vayikra, chapter 5, verse 11. Do not put oil on the meat offerings of wrongdoers. Commandment 123, Vayikra, chapter 5, verse 11. Do not put frankincense on the meal offerings of wrongdoers. Commandment 124, Vayikra, chapter 5, verse 16. One who profaned a sacred object must repay what he has profaned plus a fifth and bring a sacrifice. Commandment 125, Vayikra, chapter 5, verse 17 to 18. Bring a guilt offering when uncertain of guilt. Commandment 126, Vayikra, chapter 5, verse 23. Return a stolen object or its value. Commandment 127, Vayikra, chapter 5, verse 7 to 11. Bring a burnt offering in accordance with one's financial ability. Commandment 128, Vayikra, chapter 5, verse 8. Do not decapitate a fowl brought as a sin offering. Commandment 129, Vayikra, chapter 6, verse 10. Remove the ashes from the altar every day. Commandment 130, Vayikra, chapter 6, verse 12. Do not extinguish the fire on the altar. Commandment 131, Vayikra, chapter 6, verse 16. Do not eat the meal offering of the high priest. Commandment 132, Vayikra, chapter 6, verse 16. The priests must eat the remains of the meal offering. Commandment 133, Vayikra, chapter 6, verse 17. Do not bake a meal offering as leavened bread. Commandment 134, Vayikra, chapter 6, verse 20. The high priest must bring a meal offering every day. Commandment 135, Vayikra, chapter 6, verse 23. Do not eat the meat of the inner sin offering. Commandment 136, Vayikra, chapter 6, verse 25 to 30. Carry out the procedure of the sin offering. Commandment 137, Vayikra, chapter 6, verse 6. Bring a guilt offering when guilt is determined. Commandment 138, Vayikra, chapter 6, verse 9. Keep the fire burning on the altar. Commandment 139, Vayikra, chapter 7, verse 1. Carry out the procedure of the guilt offering. Commandment 140, Vayikra, chapter 7, verse 11. Follow the procedure of the peace offering. Commandment 141, Vayikra, chapter 7, verse 17. Burn the leftover sacrifices. Commandment 142, Vayikra, chapter 7, verse 18. Do not eat from sacrifices offered with improper intentions. Commandment 143, Vayikra, chapter 7, verse 19. Do not eat from sacrifices which became impure. Commandment 144, Vayikra, chapter 7, verse 19. Burn all impure sacrifices. Commandment 145, Vayikra, chapter 7, verse 20. An impure person must not eat from sacrifices. Commandment 146, Vayikra, chapter 10, verse 19. Mourn for relatives. Commandment 147, Vayikra, chapter 10, verse 6. A priest must not enter the temple with long hair. Commandment 148, Vayikra, chapter 10, verse 6. A priest must not enter the temple with torn clothes. Commandment 149, Vayikra, chapter 10, verse 7. A priest must not leave the temple during service. Commandment 150, Vayikra, chapter 10, verse 9. A priest must not enter the temple intoxicated. Commandment 151, Vayikra, chapter 11, verse 11. Do not eat non-kosher fish. Commandment 152, Vayikra, chapter 11, verse 13. Do not eat non-kosher fowl. Commandment 153, Vayikra, chapter 11, verse 2. Examine the signs of animals to distinguish between those which are kosher and non-kosher. Commandment 154, Vayikra, chapter 11, verse 21. Examine the signs of insects to distinguish between those which are kosher and non-kosher. Commandment 155, Vayikra, chapter 11, verse 29. Observe the laws of impurity caused by the 8 listed insects. Commandment 156, Vayikra, chapter 11, verse 34. Observe the laws of impurity concerning liquids and solid foods. Commandment 157, Vayikra, chapter 11, verse 39. Observe the laws of impurity caused by a dead beast. Commandment 158, Vayikra, chapter 11, verse 4. Do not eat non-kosher animals. Commandment 159, Vayikra, chapter 11, verse 41. Do not eat non-kosher creatures that crawl the land. Commandment 160, Vayikra, chapter 11, verse 42. Do not eat worms found in fruit on the ground. Commandment 161, Vayikra, chapter 11, verse 43. Do not eat creatures that live in water other than kosher fish. Commandment 162, Vayikra, chapter 11, verse 44. Do not eat non-kosher vermin. Commandment 163, Vayikra, chapter 11, verse 9. Examine the signs of fish to distinguish between those are kosher and non-kosher. Commandment 164, Vayikra, chapter 12, verse 2. Observe the laws of impurity caused by childbirth. Commandment 165, Vayikra, chapter 12, verse 3. Circumcise all males on the 8th day after their birth. Commandment 166, Vayikra, chapter 12, verse 6. A woman who gave birth must bring an offering after she immerses in water. Commandment 167, Vayikra, chapter 13, verse 12. Follow the commandments of human leprosy as prescribed in the law. Commandment 168, Vayikra, chapter 13, verse 33. The unclean person must not shave signs of impurity in his hair. Commandment 169, Vayikra, chapter 13, verse 34. Carry out the laws of leprosy of houses. Commandment 170, Vayikra, chapter 13, verse 45. The unclean person must publicize his condition by tearing his garments, allowing his hair to grow, and covering his lips. Commandment 171, Vayikra, chapter 13, verse 47. Carry out the laws of leprosy of clothing. Commandment 172, Vayikra, chapter 14, verse 10. An unclean person must carry an offering after immersing in water. Commandment 173, Vayikra, chapter 14, verse 2. Carry out the prescribed rules for purifying the unclean person. Commandment 174, Vayikra, chapter 14, verse 9. The unclean person must shave off all his hair prior to purification. Commandment 175, Vayikra, chapter 15, verses 13 to 14. A man who has a running unnatural urinary issue must bring an offering after he immerses in water. Commandment 176, Vayikra, chapter 15, verse 16. Observe the laws of impurity of a seminal emission. Commandment 177, Vayikra, chapter 15, verse 16. Every impure person must immerse himself in water to become pure. Commandment 178, Vayikra, chapter 15, verse 19. Observe the laws of menstrual impurity. Commandment 179, Vayikra, chapter 15, verse 25. Observe the laws of impurity caused by a woman's running issue. Commandment 180, Vayikra, chapter 15, verse 28 to 29. A woman who has a running vaginal issue must bring an offering after she immerses in water. Commandment 181, Vayikra, chapter 15, verse 3. Observe the laws of impurity caused by a man's running issue. Commandment 182, Vayikra, chapter 16, verse 2. A priest must not enter the temple indiscriminately. Commandment 183, Vayikra, chapter 16, verse 29. Afflict yourself on the Day of Atonement. Commandment 184, Vayikra, chapter 16, verse 3. Follow the procedures of the Day of Atonement in the sequence prescribed. Commandment 185, Vayikra, chapter 17, verse 13. Cover the blood of a slaughtered fowl or beast with earth. Commandment 186, Vayikra, chapter 17, verse 3 to 4. Do not slaughter sacrifices outside the courtyard. Commandment 187, Vayikra, chapter 18, verse 10. Do not have sexual relations with your son's daughter. Commandment 188, Vayikra, chapter 18, verse 10. Do not have sexual relations with your daughter's daughter. Commandment 189, Vayikra, chapter 18, verse 11. Do not have sexual relations with your father's wife's daughter. Commandment 190, Vayikra, chapter 18, verse 12. Do not have sexual relations with your father's sister. Commandment 191, Vayikra, chapter 18, verse 13. Do not have sexual relations with your mother's sister. Commandment 192, Vayikra, chapter 18, verse 14. Do not have sexual relations with your father's brother's wife. Commandment 193, Vayikra, chapter 18, verse 14. Do not have sexual relations with your father's brother. Commandment 194, Vayikra, chapter 18, verse 15. Do not have sexual relations with your son's wife. Commandment 195, Vayikra, chapter 18, verse 16. Do not have sexual relations with your brother's wife. Commandment 196, Vayikra, chapter 18, verse 17. Do not have sexual relations with a woman and her daughter. Commandment 197, Vayikra, chapter 18, verse 17. Do not have sexual relations with a woman and her son's daughter. Commandment 198, Vayikra, chapter 18, verse 17. Do not have sexual relations with a woman and her daughter's daughter. Commandment 199, Vayikra, chapter 18, verse 18. Do not have sexual relations with your wife's sister. Commandment 200, Vayikra, chapter 18, verse 19. Do not have sexual relations with a menstrually impure woman. Commandment 201, Vayikra, chapter 18, verse 20. Do not have sexual relations with someone else's wife. Commandment 202, Vayikra, chapter 18, verse 21. Do not pass your children through the fire to Molech. Commandment 203, Vayikra, chapter 18, verse 22. Do not have homosexual relations. Commandment 204, Vayikra, chapter 18, verse 23. A man must not have sexual relations with an animal. Commandment 205, Vayikra, chapter 18, verse 23. A woman must not have sexual relations with an animal. Commandment 206, Vayikra, chapter 18, verse 6 and 10. Do not have sexual relations with your daughter. Commandment 207, Vayikra, chapter 18, verse 6. Do not make sexual contact with any forbidden woman. Commandment 208, Vayikra, chapter 18, verse 7. Do not have sexual relations with your mother. Commandment 209, Vayikra, chapter 18, verse 7. Do not have sexual relations with your father. Commandment 210, Vayikra, chapter 18, verse 8. Do not have sexual relations with your father's wife. Commandment 211, Vayikra, chapter 18, verse 9. Do not have sexual relations with your sister. Commandment 212, Vayikra, chapter 19, verse 10. Leave the corner of the field uncut for the poor. Commandment 213, Vayikra, chapter 19, verse 10. Leave the gleanings of the vineyard for the poor. Commandment 214, Vayikra, chapter 19, verse 10. Do not gather the gleanings of a vineyard, but leave them for the poor. Commandment 215, Vayikra, chapter 19, verse 10. Leave the unformed clusters of grapes for the poor. Commandment 216, Vayikra, chapter 19, verse 10. Do not pick the unformed clusters of grapes, but leave them for the poor. Commandment 217, Vayikra, chapter 19, verse 11. Do not deny possession of something entrusted to you. Commandment 218, Vayikra, chapter 19, verse 11. Do not swear in denial of a monetary claim. Commandment 219, Vayikra, chapter 19, verse 11. Do not steal money stealthily. Commandment 220, Vayikra, chapter 19, verse 12. Do not swear falsely in Adonai's name. Commandment 221, Vayikra, chapter 19, verse 13. Do not rob openly. Commandment 222, Vayikra, chapter 19, verse 13. Do not withhold wages or fail to repay a debt. Commandment 223, Vayikra, chapter 19, verse 13. Do not delay payment of wages past the agreed time. Commandment 224, Vayikra, chapter 19, verse 14. Do not put a stumbling block before a blind man. Commandment 225, Vayikra, chapter 19, verse 14. Do not curse any upstanding Jew. Commandment 226, Vayikra, chapter 19, verse 15. A judge must not have mercy on the poor man at the trial. Commandment 227, Vayikra, chapter 19, verse 15. A judge must not respect the great man at the trial. Commandment 228, Vayikra, chapter 19, verse 15. A judge must not pervert justice. Commandment 229, Vayikra, chapter 19, verse 15. Judge righteously. Commandment 230, Vayikra, chapter 19, verse 16. Do not speak derogatorily of others. Commandment 231, Vayikra, chapter 19, verse 16. Do not stand idly by if someone's life is in danger. Commandment 232, Vayikra, chapter 19, verse 17. Do not hate fellow Jews. Commandment 233, Vayikra, chapter 19, verse 17. Reprove a neighbor who sins. Commandment 234, Vayikra, chapter 19, verse 17. Do not embarrass others. Commandment 235, Vayikra, chapter 19, verse 18. Love other Jews. Commandment 236, Vayikra, chapter 19, verse 18. Do not take revenge. Commandment 237, Vayikra, chapter 19, verse 18. Do not bear a grudge. Commandment 238, Vayikra, chapter 19, verse 19. Do not plant diverse seeds together. Commandment 239, Vayikra, chapter 19, verse 19. Do not crossbreed animals. Commandment 240, Vayikra, chapter 19, verse 23. Do not eat fruit of a tree during its first 3 years. Commandment 241, Vayikra, chapter 19, verse 24. The 4th year crops must be totally for holy purposes, like the second tithe. Commandment 242, Vayikra, chapter 19, verse 26. Do not be superstitious. Commandment 243, Vayikra, chapter 19, verse 26. Do not engage in astrology. Commandment 244, Vayikra, chapter 19, verse 27. Men must not shave the hair off the sides of their head. Commandment 245, Vayikra, chapter 19, verse 27. Men must not shave their beards with a razor. Commandment 246, Vayikra, chapter 19, verse 28. Do not tattoo the skin. Commandment 247, Vayikra, chapter 19, verse 3. Fear your father and mother. Commandment 248, Vayikra, chapter 19, verse 30. Show reverence to the temple. Commandment 249, Vayikra, chapter 19, verse 31. Do not inquire of spirits. Commandment 250, Vayikra, chapter 19, verse 31. Do not consult magicians or seers. Commandment 251, Vayikra, chapter 19, verse 32. Honor those who teach and know the Torah. Commandment 252, Vayikra, chapter 19, verse 35. Do not commit injustice with scales and weights. Commandment 253, Vayikra, chapter 19, verse 36. Each individual must ensure that his scales and weights are accurate. Commandment 254, Vayikra, chapter 19, verse 4. Do not inquire into idolatry. Commandment 255, Vayikra, chapter 19, verse 4. Do not make an idol for others. Commandment 256, Vayikra, chapter 19, verse 8. Do not eat from that which was left over from an offering. Commandment 257, Vayikra, chapter 19, verse 9. Do not reap the corner of a field left for the poor. Commandment 258, Vayikra, chapter 19, verse 9. Leave gleanings from a field for the poor. Commandment 259, Vayikra, chapter 19, verse 9. Do not gather gleanings from a field, but leave them for the poor. Commandment 260, Vayikra, chapter 20, verse 10. The courts must carry out the death penalty of strangulation. Commandment 261, Vayikra, chapter 20, verse 14. The courts must carry out the death penalty of burning. Commandment 262, Vayikra, chapter 20, verse 23. Do not imitate idolaters in customs and clothing. Commandment 263, Vayikra, chapter 21, verse 1. A priest must not defile himself for anyone except relatives. Commandment 264, Vayikra, chapter 21, verse 11. The high priest must not defile himself for any relative. Commandment 265, Vayikra, chapter 21, verse 11. The high priest must not enter under the same roof as a corpse. Commandment 266, Vayikra, chapter 21, verse 13. The high priest must marry a virgin maiden. Commandment 267, Vayikra, chapter 21, verse 14. The high priest must not marry a widow. Commandment 268, Vayikra, chapter 21, verse 15. The high priest must not have sexual relations with a widow even outside of marriage. Commandment 269, Vayikra, chapter 21, verse 17. A priest with a physical blemish must not serve. Commandment 270, Vayikra, chapter 21, verse 17. A priest with a temporary blemish must not serve. Commandment 271, Vayikra, chapter 21, verse 23. A priest with a physical blemish must not enter the sanctuary or approach the altar. Commandment 272, Vayikra, chapter 21, verse 7. A priest must not marry a divorcee. Commandment 273, Vayikra, chapter 21, verse 7. A priest must not marry a woman who has had forbidden sexual relationship. Commandment 274, Vayikra, chapter 21, verse 7. A priest must not marry a desecrated woman. Commandment 275, Vayikra, chapter 21, verse 8. Dedicate the priest for service. Commandment 276, Vayikra, chapter 22, verse 10. A non-priest must not eat food set aside as a gift for the priest. Commandment 277, Vayikra, chapter 22, verse 10. A hired worker or a Jewish bondsman of a priest must not eat food set aside as a gift for the priest. Commandment 278, Vayikra, chapter 22, verse 12. A desecrated woman must not eat food set aside for a priest. Commandment 279, Vayikra, chapter 22, verse 14 to 15. Do not eat untithed fruits. Commandment 280, Vayikra, chapter 22, verse 2. Impure priests must not do service in the temple. Commandment 281, Vayikra, chapter 22, verse 20. Do not dedicate a blemished animal for the altar. Commandment 282, Vayikra, chapter 22, verse 21. Offer only unblemished animals. Commandment 283, Vayikra, chapter 22, verse 21 to 22. Do not inflict wounds upon dedicated animals. Commandment 284, Vayikra, chapter 22, verse 22. Do not slaughter a blemished animal. Commandment 285, Vayikra, chapter 22, verse 22. Do not burn a blemished animal's fat. Commandment 286, Vayikra, chapter 22, verse 24. Do not castrate any males, including animals. Commandment 287, Vayikra, chapter 22, verse 24. Do not sprinkle a blemished animal's blood. Commandment 288, Vayikra, chapter 22, verse 25. Do not sacrifice blemished animals even if offered by non-Jews. Commandment 289, Vayikra, chapter 22, verse 27. Offer only animals which are at least 8 days old. Commandment 290, Vayikra, chapter 22, verse 28. Do not slaughter an animal and its offspring on the same day. Commandment 291, Vayikra, chapter 22, verse 30. Do not leave sacrifices past the time allowing for eating them. Commandment 292, Vayikra, chapter 22, verse 32. Sanctify Adonai's name. Commandment 293, Vayikra, chapter 22, verse 32. Do not profane Adonai's name. Commandment 294, Vayikra, chapter 22, verse 4. An impure priest must not eat food set aside for a priest. Commandment 295, Vayikra, chapter 22, verse 7. An impure priest following immersion must wait until after sundown before returning to service. Commandment 296, Vayikra, chapter 23, verse 10. Offer the wave offering from the meal of the new wheat. Commandment 297, Vayikra, chapter 23, verse 14. Do not eat bread from new grain before the Omer. Commandment 298, Vayikra, chapter 23, verse 14. Do not eat parched grains from new grain before the Omer. Commandment 299, Vayikra, chapter 23, verse 14. Do not eat ripened grains from new grain before the Omer. Commandment 300, Vayikra, chapter 23, verse 15. Each man must count 7 weeks from the day the new wheat offering was brought after Passover. Commandment 301, Vayikra, chapter 23, verse 17. Bring 2 loaves to accompany additional offerings in the Feast of Weeks. Commandment 302, Vayikra, chapter 23, verse 21. Rest on the Feast of Weeks. Commandment 303, Vayikra, chapter 23, verse 21. Do not do prohibited labor on the Feast of Weeks. Commandment 304, Vayikra, chapter 23, verse 24. Rest on the Feast of Trumpets. Commandment 305, Vayikra, chapter 23, verse 25. Do no prohibited labor on the Feast of Trumpets. Commandment 306, Vayikra, chapter 23, verse 29. Do not eat or drink on the Day of Atonement. Commandment 307, Vayikra, chapter 23, verse 32. Rest from prohibited labor on the Sabbath.